What's up, everyone? Rod Rodriguez here. We are in pre-production right now for the next season of Military Matters, but until we kick off in October, we're going to be releasing some In Case You Missed It, or ICYMIs, as they call it in the podcast biz. But while we're in pre-production, we could really use your help by sharing this podcast with your social media network, because word of mouth is really how we grow. And we really want this show to get bigger and bigger, and we really need your help to do that. So we really appreciate your likes, your comments, and reviews that you've left on Apple Podcasts. And if you have any ideas for stories you think we should cover, email us at militarymatters@stripes.com. But until we release in October, we're bringing you this episode. And with Halloween just around the corner, I thought it'd be fun to share this episode from season 4. And in this episode, Jack Murphy talks with Dr. Eric Kurlander, author of Hitler's Monsters, A Supernatural History of the Third Reich. It's about the Nazi obsession with the occult and how Hitler convinced a country to abandon science for the allure of mysticism. It's a really interesting episode that brings together the important discussion of nationalism, along with vampires and werewolves. So thank you all for listening, and we hope you enjoy this, in case you missed it, Pseudoscience, the Occult, and the Rise of Nazi Germany.
You have seen the Indiana Jones films and the television shows on the History Channel about Nazis and the occult. Heard stories about how Hitler was obsessed with ancient relics, developing super weapons, and how his inner circle was deeply invested in occult matters. However, the truth is stranger than fiction or even pop culture references would lead one to believe. In this episode, historian Eric Kurlander shares with us his years of research into Hitler's inner circle and their interest in pseudoscience and the occult, but goes even further to demonstrate how widespread interest in astrology, the spiritualist movement, and apocryphal tales of German folklore led to the rise of Nazi Germany. Unhappy with the state of Weimar Germany and a failed economy, with German pride and dignity lost after the First World War, the Nazi Party substituted the predicament of the German people for their own imaginary and fantastical reality. This magical reality was one of a 1,000-year Reich, an ancient Aryan super race, and their blood and soil ideology. Ironically, as Eric points out in the interview, the History Channel and other mainstream cable networks now routinely broadcast shows about ancient aliens, tales of a mythical super race that fell from grace as their culture went into decline. As you listen to this interview, you're going to be shocked how close that narrative is to what Hitler's core believers thought. That, and many other revelations, are enough to give us all pause for concern. So let's take a deep dive on how pseudoscience and the occult helped lead to the rise of Nazi Germany.
Yes, so I'm a European and German historian. I teach at Stetson University. I got my PhD at Harvard University. And my first couple books were on the decline of liberalism and liberal Democrats in the Third Reich and the compromises they make. So I've always been interested in the political history of 20th century Germany. Why did democracy fail? And obviously, like many Americans who grew up reading comic books and watching movies and seeing the History Channel, I also had an interest in the occult and Nazism as a kind of popular cultural phenomena. But it's only in the last 10 or 15 years where I started to see a resurgence of the kind of patterns I associate with the occult and supernatural thinking occurring in contemporary United States and Europe, what we associate with the alt-right. And that led me to think maybe it's time to revisit that history in an academic way to get at these larger questions that I've always been interested in, which is why did such a modern, vibrant, democratic society collapse so quickly into one of the most extreme fascist regimes we've ever had? So it's interesting that, especially in Germany, but not only Germany, it's seen as a kind of problematic assumption to tie these things together. But in the Anglo-American world, Britain, United States, Canada, Australia, there is a fascination. So I wanted to see what the real history was.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right that there's this fascinating, an enduring fascination with Nazi Germany amongst Americans. I mean, I certainly notice, and some would argue maybe too much fascination, particularly with the SS and some of the so-called elite units. But I was wondering, what do you attribute that to? Do you think it has to do with the fact that they were white Europeans, that they look a lot like us, that we share a lot of cultural traits, but they went down such like a horrible, evil path?
No, and then that, I mean, first of all, it's not only in what we might call the Anglo-American sphere, because if you remember, there was a South Korean bar that opened up with an SS theme a number of years ago. And then, of course, this kind of proves the point. I think Prince Harry dressed up in a Nazi uniform. So they're almost comic book figures, or I use the term monsters, out of a kind of fictional universe, right? They epitomize the dark side of all of Western industrial society. And I think that's where the fascination comes from, because it is familiar. It's not foreign enough for us to have enough distance from it to just kind of be modestly invested in understanding what went on. We recognize ourselves in the Third Reich and in modern Germany, whether we admit it or not. And I think that's where the fascination comes from. And of course, that's the premise for a lot of us who study it, is this was a society a lot like the United States. We get into why many historians, sociologists, political scientists see Germany as a kind of laboratory of modernity. But there was a lot more that Germany and America had in common than, let's say, Germany and France, or Germany and Russia, or even Great Britain by the 20th century.
I think one of the things that makes your work unique is you talk about the occult, not just in the elite classes in Germany, be it the bourgeoisie or the political elite in the Third Reich, but in everyday Germany, that there were these things starting with astrology, but then going way off on all sorts of fringes and things you call border science in the book. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, about the sort of presence of the supernatural in Weimar Germany.
Right. So I argue that before World War I, and not only in Germany, there is a resurgence of interest in these three different strands of supernatural thinking. What we might call the occult doctrines like Theosophy, Ariosophy, Freemasonry, Anthroposophy, border science, so sciences that are on the border of what's considered acceptable science, or that studies energies that are on the border of our experience, so hidden, however you want to call it, which obviously overlaps with some things we'd call occult, but talking about astrology, parapsychology, world ice theory, dowsing, with radiesthesia, they called it. And then the third kind of cluster of ideas or practices which experienced resurgence in the late 19th century is alternative or pagan religion. Right? Whether it's Eastern influenced investment in yoga and Hinduism, Buddhism, interest in Tibet, pagan, Germanic or pre-Christian, or even Luciferian traditions, Wiccanism, there's definitely, in the wake of industrialization and a more scientific oriented world, people are searching for kind of new paths or new spiritualities. It's not that Germany's unique in doing that. It's just that the phenomena in Germany and Austria, I argue, are both much more politicized. They're not just things you do in your drawing room to have fun with your date on the weekend. It's something that starts to influence the way people view the world. And the content of these occult doctrines and border sciences in Germany and Austria tends to be more colored by racial theories. So there's racial theories underlying a lot of these ideas, even in Britain and Russia and America, but they really are salient in the late 19th century in the German versions. So like if you went to a theosophic meeting in Britain or America and you went to Germany, the British and Americans are talking about getting in touch with their ancient kind of alien parapsychological faculties. And if you go to the German one, they're mentioning that, but then they're also talking about the purity of the ancient Aryan race that dominated Atlantis. So there's these slight differences which, magnified in the 20s and 30s, help us to understand why so many Germans found this kind of supernatural imaginary so attractive. And just to your point about class, it's very clear that these ideas are very strong among the lower middle classes. So it tends to be these kind of disaffected Protestants, the lower middle classes, who aren't quite comfortable with modernity, but have rejected traditional religion, who seem to be the most attracted. And by the way, that happens to be the socioeconomic group then and now, which is most attracted to fascism. Yeah.
I think it's really fascinating that you have a class of people that they have this agrarian nostalgia for going back in time and village life and Volkish tradition. But at the same time, these are people who have never lived in a village a day in their lives. These are people who have never worked a farm, have no idea what that lifestyle is like. But yet, and as you point out, it's not only, I believe, in Indian politics in the country of India, there's also a glamorization of village life amongst the elites. But these are people who would never, ever want to live in a village.
Not all of them, because remember, Germany in the late 19th century was just becoming exactly like the United States around that time, 50-50. Now, by the 20s, it was more like 65-35. But the Nazis did very well among small town voters and farmers, who were still a significant, if no longer majority constituency. It's just that, as you point out, it's often the lower middle classes in the cities who also glorify this idea of going to the countryside, the warrior peasant who's going to take back the Eastern territories, right? That's something that the Artemannen in the 20s glorified, and they had solstice festivals. It just happens that a bunch of SS people like Himmler and Daré were members of the Artemannen, right? You know, the empirical evidence is direct. It's not a speculation that these interests are connected. And, you know, Himmler was not a highly educated person. He was a bright, petty bourgeois, right? I think his father was a music teacher. He grew up in a kind of solidly lower middle class household. So the people most attracted to these ideas probably have the least formal academic training, but academics also got invested in it, which is also a little worrisome, right?
Hitler himself, I think, was interesting because he definitely had some investments and some equities in the supernatural. But at the same time, he saw a lot of these people as like more like fellow travelers. Like he saw this as something he could use in his rise to power. You know, you write in your book about how some of the Nazis were true believers in the paranormal. Others used it when it was advantageous to them and minimalized it when it wasn't.
Exactly. Right. So I started the research for this in 2008. That's when I started to notice these things in broader society. That was around the time the Tea Party came up and you started to see alt-right movements like the AfD in Germany, 2008, 2009, 2010. Since then, we now have contemporary examples that help illustrate this. So one of the things that I quote from Mein Kampf is Hitler, very cognizant that the early Nazi party was very much embedded in these kind of occult and pagan religious and border scientific traditions, complaining that the party wasn't going to do well if it's a bunch of wandering scholars in bearskins, right? The idea that you go out in the woods and you try to get in touch with, you know, Odin's berserkers, or you become a werewolf, or you. And what's interesting now, after like January 6th, think about the QAnon shaman wearing literally animal skin. So this tradition on the far right, this folkish tradition, Hitler recognized that it was both potentially embarrassing and alienating for the smarter, kind of better educated bourgeoisie that he knew hated communism and was nationalist, but would be a little uncomfortable. At the same time, he knew that's where his bread was buttered. So what you see Hitler doing and some other Nazis like Goebbels is trying to manage these ideas, a wink and a nod, not quite embracing it, but then recognizing, because it is about esoteric symbols and little phrases, you know, Mike Flynn saying what he needs to say to appeal to those constituents. So the fascists in the interwar period knew how to do that. Some of them believed in it. Some of them actually would do. I mean, Himmler believed in a lot of this stuff. He had round tables in his castle. He believed in kind of Grail theories. Hitler, he did have a dowser come and check for cancer-causing death rays in the Reich Chancellery. So Hitler was not averse to these ideas, but compared to Himmler or Rudolf Hess, it was more utilitarian.
It's almost like it's a two-tiered ideology. I mean, really, it's just tailored to different audiences is all it really is, right? To try to create, as some people have said about QAnon, that it's a big tent conspiracy theory, that it incorporates all of these different ideas into one thing. And, as I was reading your book and as I've, been working, as a journalist the last few years, I can't help but hear some of the QAnon stuff about ritualistic child abuse and deep state conspiracies and not think, man, this is recycled Hitler Youth propaganda.
If you look at interwar, talking about the 20s and 30s, fascist movements, when they would talk about a new world order or Jews meeting in a Prague graveyard and sacrificing Christian children, or, trying to have destroy the race through using their wealth. And then you look at this obsession with Epstein, right? It's the same, or Soros running a world conspiracy. It's the same patterns that you see in interwar fascism, just framed in a 21st century idiom. Fascism is an attempt to unite or draw upon elements of the three major kind of ideologies of the 19th century: liberalism, conservatism, and socialism. Well, those are not compatible ideologies. So how do you have your cake and eat it? How do you appeal to disaffected groups who in some ways find elements of all three of those attractive? You come up with supernatural or border scientific or irrational kind of all-inclusive theories, tropes, effective traditions or rituals that get away from discussing tax policy or education policy or empirical and scientific reality. That's what fascism does very well. It's a ideology of negation. Here are your enemies. Here are the monstrous others trying to get you. Here's what we have to do to defend ourselves. It's not really about what's the best marginal tax rate. It's when the right gives up and goes to the far right and says, we've got to find a way to square the circle. And so the Nazis were very good at that. Other right-wing parties hadn't done that as well. They were still too traditionally conservative, too elitist, or they were liberal parties that still nominally claimed they believed in liberal democracy and the Constitution. And that, of course, didn't work for these people, these populist elements who just were sick of democracy. And you see the same thing now. You have conservatives who are kind of apologizing for the fact they still care about the Constitution and certain separation of powers and not having the executive or legislative, but they're uncomfortable doing it because they know that doesn't work on the far right. And that's what the Nazis did, is they just embraced that. And of course, then your ideology is incoherent. So you have to draw on supernatural imaginary and conspiracy theories and appeal to nationalism and create monsters that can be the target, internal and external, for the disaffected, usually white Protestant men who feel most alienated in modern society.
And I mean, that came through really strong in your book. I think that, you had this massive depression after World War I, all of these disaffected people, World War I veterans, they had just lost huge numbers of troops during the war. And the Nazis used this sort of magical realism, this rejection of science and imperialism, or empirical data, I should say, not imperialism, but to leapfrog out of their current situation and jump into something completely new. And it's like they needed magic to get there, that there wasn't a clear path forward for that society. So they kind of descended into the supernatural to recreate their eventually an empire.
Well, they had 10 years, right? So what's really important, and this is why, let's get back to my comment about why Germany is a laboratory for historians and political scientists, sociologists. The Germans were actually pretty resilient. If you look at the fact that they had not had liberal democracy, a true liberal democracy, right? They had a monarchy that was quasi-constitutional through World War I. The fact that it lasted 10 years without anything like the Nazis getting a lot of votes, despite inflation, lost war, Versailles, shows you that the majority of Germans wanted it to work. And we also have to remember the Nazis never got more than about a third. Now, if you look at the people who are willing to vote alt-right in France, the Netherlands, the United States today, for a candidate who explicitly denies the reality of what's going on, science, the Constitution, the outcome of elections, we're getting close to 35, 40% or more. So it's not that Germany was unique. This is what's scary. It's that it took a huge amount of crises, internal and external, a lost war, and then the Great Depression to trigger enough of these kind of latent these kind of latent neuroses or pathologies, so people abandon mainstream parties in the center and right and move to the far right. It took a lot to do it, but the bridge to doing that, which was there already, was this supernatural imaginary. So my argument would be, as I say in the book, without the socioeconomic crises, the political crises, Weimar's inability, the democracy struggling to have a majority, Hitler still wouldn't have come to power. He never got a majority, but he created enough of a constituency through the use of these ideas. What held that together? A common imagined community based on folkish ideology,
The fictive kinship,
paganism, all these kinds of things, right? Yeah, blood and soil, mysticism, militarism. They did a great job of exploiting that, and the supernatural imaginary helps you do that.
Before we move on, let's go ahead and talk about the elite true believers, the stuff that comic books are made of. Himmler and a few of his other cadre who were like deeply invested. They were the true believers in this sort of occultic practices. And I mean, what were some of the weird things that they believed? And I mean, why was this even important to them?
It was mainstream then in certain circles, and it's mainstream now. So if you watch the History Channel, they have this show, I think it's on the History, Ancient Aliens. Now I don't have time for this, but I've glanced at it, right? And the theory behind it is that aliens at some point arrived and they were superior beings. They mated with humans. They created some superior civilization. It declined, but there's still vestiges of it. And there are people who may have inherited. You get it, right? Well, that's exactly what Himmler and those people believed in, that they're based on various occult doctrines from the 19th century, theosophy, that there had been an ancient Aryan civilization which was superior to other races and civilizations, probably because of some kind of extraterrestrial blood or spirit. It may have been somehow akin to or explain the Nordic gods and Nordic mythology. There was some catastrophe, a flood, giant balls of ice hitting the earth, raised sea levels, destroyed that civilization, which we call Atlantis, they called the Thule. And the superior people were left, had to go to places that were very high. They went to parts of Northern Europe, Tibet, to maintain their superior civilization, religion, and culture. We have elements of that among petty bourgeois, white, quasi-Christian men in American Britain today. They love that stuff. Isn't it possible that there were frost giants? So Himmler was the epitome of a kind of smart, semi-educated, widely but unsystematically read individual who got way too much power and then tried to test or prove his non-scientific theories and got angry at mainstream academics when they didn't accept them. And because he had so much money and power, he did manage, in a way that no modern democracy should ever allow, to have his own research institutes, police, and army, where he could, and even his own rocket program, where he could experiment with all this stuff, including human beings, right? If you took some of the people who watch Ancient Aliens and think it's true, got them angry enough about immigrants and foreigners, and where they were in an existential war, and gave them ultimate power, they're the second most powerful person in a fascist country, they might do some of the same stuff. So I guess what I'm saying is it's not that bizarre that he thought you could re-engineer racial superiority through breeding, that he experimented with human beings with extreme cold or extreme heat, sometimes based on fairy tales like The Fisherman's Wife, about how human warmth somehow has a better effect in resuscitating a dead person or near dead person than artificial warmth. Thor's lightning, believing there may have been an actual hidden force that ancient Nordic people could harness, and that's where the idea of Thor's hammer came from, and maybe you could harness it now. Searching for gold in the Rhine based on Wagner. We could go through a death ray machine that he wanted to create, dowsers that he sent with the Waffen SS to search for various things underground. But he was not unique. It's the Nazis were drawing on popular ideas that existed in Germany, Austria, Britain, France, and are around today, right? That this obsession with symbols, swastikas, sun wheels. Look at, again, some of the QAnon stuff. So I don't want to dismiss it as crazy. Of course, it doesn't hold up to scientific inquiry or empirical reasoning, but Himmler represented a demographic which is very powerful in Europe and America today.
Yeah, I mean, he really is sort of like the character out of Indiana Jones or something like that. He was drinking his own Kool-Aid. I mean, he actually believed this nonsense.
Well, you're using nonsense. So first of all, what's really unfair in dismissing all of this is the reason they're all invested in it is they've ceased to believe in Christianity in the conventional way. And when you look at America to even today, but certainly American Europe back then, there were a lot of devout Christians, many of whom were also fascist, but they were tended to be a little less devout fascists than the people who were a little more critical of Christianity. My point is they were looking for a substitute. But you also can't prove that Jewish guys in Palestine rise from the dead. So it's bad social science to dismiss the views of Himmler or people who watch Ancient Aliens now as nonsense if you know anyone who's devout Christian, Muslim, or Jew. Because if they are, they probably are also going to claim miracles happen. It's just seen as acceptable. And my argument in the book is that traditional religion, while certainly not helpful in maintaining liberal democracy, if you look at people who are devoutly religious, they are more likely to support authoritarianism generally and more skeptical of science. It did insulate them, my argument is, from some of these alternative ideas in the supernatural imaginary. So the Catholics didn't vote for Nazis to the same degree as Protestants. What I've added to that sociological knowledge we've had for 100 years is maybe one reason they didn't, again, is they had their own supernatural imaginary, which conflicted with this set of alternative beliefs. Because if you talk about all these Nordic frost giants, world ice theory, pagan religion, that doesn't really work. That's heretical in Catholic circles. Do you see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So it's not that it was nonsense by the standards of people who are otherwise religious. It's just an alternative. And this one happened to be really dangerous. As I would argue the alternative is now. I would say, someone right now who's a devout Lutheran or Methodist or a Catholic who actually listens to our current Pope is less likely to become a fascist or a racist than someone who claims they have a personal relationship with Jesus but doesn't go to a traditional Lutheran church, doesn't really listen to or read the traditional theology, doesn't much care about those, right? So my argument is a complex one, that being non-secular, being religious doesn't automatically make you a fascist. There are people who argue that Christianity led to fascism, right? I'm arguing that Christianity, devout Judaism, being a fundamentalist Muslim, can lead to bad political outcomes and often does. But when it's unmoored completely from some kind of theological tradition, and anything is possible. And that's what Himmler and Hess were arguing. They would kind of pick and choose from anything they wanted to make sense of their racial theories and their military and geopolitical aspirations, right? And that's the kind of thing now that I would argue is most dangerous, because you can't test it and you can't push back against it. But it's not nonsense. There's a coherence to it in their minds.
I have seen some articles written where pastors were interviewed, and they talk about trying to keep their flock on track towards Christianity, as many of them are starting to veer off into this sort of like anti-vaxxer. And yeah, so that's what you're referring to, that Christianity can be a firewall against fascism.
Exact Christianity. And so some of my colleagues on the left, and I'm not saying I'm not arguing that I'm on the right, but I'm arguing empirically, I think they overestimate the way that traditional religion leads to radical right-wing politics. It can. I mean, certainly the fascism in Italy and Spain was allied with the church. Germany, less so. The churches supported Nazism, but not as strongly, partly because they were uncomfortable with this alternative supernatural imaginary, right? And these alternative mythologies of Indo-Aryan superiority. They weren't quite compatible. The Protestants had an easier time of it, though, because Protestants don't have to adhere to a set of universal values set by the Vatican, regardless of race, religion, age, or sex. Protestants can do whatever they want in many traditions based on their own, again, personal relationship with Jesus or what their pastor tells them. And that's why, whether it was the Klan in the United States or the Nazis, they did best among Protestants, because Protestants have the most flexibility and malleability in melding their putative Christian beliefs with racial theories, anti-Semitism. I mean, think of the bizarreness there. Christianity, as the Nazis often pointed out, came out of Judaism. And yet, look at how strong anti-Semitism has been in many,
and Jesus
especially
was a
Protestant. Well, but not according to the Nazis who wanted to salvage Christianity. They literally, as I talk about in the book, you can do this when you're a supernatural thinker, right? They separated the New and Old Testament, and they said that Jesus was actually a lost Aryan, or a member of a lost Aryan tribe. He was probably Balder in the Nordic tradition, Balder who died, went to hell, and came back. And that Paul and the Jews tried to corrupt Christianity to pacify and weaken the Aryan race. But the true Christianity of Jesus was a Nordic religion that got corrupted by Jews, who, of course, were the Semitic people who dominated the Middle East. I'm not making this up. This wasn't some fringe idea. Hundreds and thousands of theologians and bright people spread these ideas, and millions of people in the Third Reich did believe some of this stuff, that you could separate. It was called German Christianity. You could just get rid of the Old Testament. Religion could be a firewall against this kind of thinking, but in practice, it often provides like a gateway drug for it. But it's not the same thing. And I'm trying to point out that to call one nonsense and say the other is acceptable is not scientifically accurate.
I thought that was definitely a key point in your book, that the Nazis were not Christian, which was kind of shocking. And they kind of, again, I got the feeling from your book that they kind of kept that on the down low a little bit, at least initially. And with today's fascists, I mean, when I listen to, unfortunately, some of the charismatic leaders in the background, they make hints at it as well, that Christianity they see as some sort of foreign imposition on, white Anglo America.
That's interesting. Yeah, I'd be interested to hear more of that. First of all, the Nazis were very careful. So some of them, I mean, Goebbels was raised Catholic, Hitler was raised Catholic, Goering Protestant. I mean, they recognized and admired the ability of Christianity to basically propagandize and create an ideology, right? Himmler talked about the SS being a kind of alternative set of Jesuits. Hitler constantly talked about providence and positive Christianity. So my argument would be they privately, the most kind of devout Nazi leaders were very uncomfortable with Christianity, but they also recognized how embedded it was in Western and German culture and the ways they could co-opt it or modify it or transmogrify it. And so in the chapter where I talk about religion, I don't say that they weren't Christian, because Christianity, as I'm trying to point out here, is so malleable. Mm-hmm. What they were is they rejected traditional Christianity. They thought the Catholic Church had been completely co-opted by Jews. Their theory was that the papacy was basically in league with Jewish notables from the Middle Ages on, and came up with witchcraft and heresy as a way of eliminating Aryans. So if you call the women witches, you can kill them and they can't have children. So then that will end the Aryan race, or the Aryan race will lose its kind of its Earth Mother leaders, and of course it won't have Aryan children in the same degree. Of course, this is all totally not reality, but a lot of Nazi leaders claim that about the Catholic Church. With Protestants, they're more ambivalent because they liked Luther. Luther was racist, anti-Semitic, wrote in German. He was a hero of a lot of German nationalists. Said, well, if you're a devout Lutheran, you don't really talk about the Old Testament, you accept theories that Jesus was blonde and blue-eyed, you can be a good Nazi. And I have a colleague, Richard Steinman Gall, wrote a book called The Holy Reich, where he argues that if you accept this malleable form of Protestant Christianity, the Nazis actually were in some ways Christian. But I think it's more accurate to say it's one of the traditions they drew on, along with Indo-Aryan religions like Hinduism and Buddhism, along with Shinto to some degree, and paganism, Nordic paganism, to create their own kind of amalgam of a racialized Indo-Aryan religio-mythological tradition that they thought was compatible with the Third Reich. Does that make sense?
Well, it makes sense when you try to step into their shoes a little bit. That was something that I took out of your book as well that I thought was fascinating, and I wanted to ask you about was how they were reaching out to Tibet, to India. They were trying to make inroads in Palestine to create this sort of like bizarre monomyth about an Aryan civilization that stretches through Eurasia.
Right.
And that's like kind of hard for most of us to wrap our minds around, because our interpretation of the Nazis is this profoundly racist regime that just murders anybody who's not Aryan. So what were they trying to accomplish with that, with those sorts of not just scientific expeditions they were making to Tibet, but actual political alliances with, you know, what we would call today, quote unquote, people of color?
First of all, let's remember that as anthropologists, biologists, geneticists have shown, there is no coherent race due to the way that human beings evolved and mixed, and we all have some Neanderthal. So by definition, if you're a devout racist, you're not technically a racist in any way that makes scientific sense, because it's not accurate. How could Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, who had been in Europe for 1,000 years, intermarried or intermixed with Slavs and Germans, be so horrific, but you wanted to work with Indians and Arabs? It makes no sense biologically. But I'd argue the Ku Klux Klan makes no sense. But it's race. I guess in a way, I think people, even liberals, somehow think racist. There might be something to what they're claiming, that there might be some essential difference there that makes sense. The reality is there isn't over large populations, anything. And so it's always going to be mythological. The Nazis' mythology was organized around these two strands of kind of Indo-Aryan and what I call Aryo-Germanic mythology or race theory. There was some tension between them, right? And this goes again back to the 19th century, the Romantic era. There were race theorists who thought the most pure, powerful, kind of physically and spiritually superior people were Nordic people from Scandinavia, and the Germans, to the degree that they could recover their Nordic blood, could also be superior. And then it radiates out from there. And then there were those, and this includes, I would argue, Himmler, said, well, actually, there's this Indo-Aryan, ancient Indo-Aryan race, which is the core of all great civilizations, the Persians, the Brahmins in India, right? The racially superior racist people who ran everything. Not all people on the subcontinent, because Himmler and Brahmin Indians would argue those were lesser races. The people who led Japanese civilization clearly in their minds must have had Indo-Aryan blood, because look how impressive they were. Maybe not as much as Europeans. And so the theory that Rosenberg, Himmler, but not just these Nazi leaders had, is that this Indo-Aryan Atlantean civilization that you see now on the History Channel, Ancient Aliens,
yeah,
right, somehow created the ruling class, at least in all these great civilizations, Greco-Roman. And because they intermarried and or didn't preserve their race, they declined. And the goal of the Nazis would be to get Aryan civilization to resuscitate itself. And for them, that was a complicated process. And just because a Jew had blue eyes and blonde hair didn't make them recoverable, because Jews were so monstrous and superhumanly evil that if you were actually Jewish, I mean, there's a famous anecdote where Himmler, who hated visiting the killing fields because he had a petty bourgeois mentality, had never actually been at war, never killed anyone, felt he had to at some point. And there was a blonde, blue-eyed child who he pulled out of the firing line and kind of thought that there must be a Pole who got stuck there or something, said, "Why are you there?" And of course, "I'm with my parents." And he said, "Well, is your father Jewish?" "Nodded." "Is your mother Jewish?" He said, "I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do." For him, it's this mystical quality. Jews were vampiric monsters. It has nothing to do with actual science, right? And so this Indo-Aryan mythology helped square the circle for them to get away with any bizarre theory they wanted. And I'm arguing that those theories came from 19th century Western romantic thinkers, not necessarily biologists, though some biologists embraced them, right?
A lot of it came out of like almost Victorian spiritualism, like you mentioned Madame Blavatsky in the book, who
right.
I came across in the past in Iraq because I worked with the Yazidis, and they are, kind of tarred and feathered by some people to this day as devil worshippers by Miss Blavatsky's book.
So let me draw a contemporary connection there. There's a tradition called traditionalism, right? Which was started by some French thinkers in the early 20th century. One of the adherents of this theory is a guy named Julius Evola, who is a radically racist, mystical, fascist adjacent guy. He hung out with Mussolini. Mussolini even thought he was a little too crazy. So he went to Germany and did research in SS archives about the great noble Aryan races, astrology, parapsychology. He was into all of that stuff. Because he didn't actually run any camps and wasn't technically a Nazi, after the war, he became the kind of doyen of far-right thinking in Italy, Central Europe. And Steve Bannon loves Julius Evola and this traditionalist strain. What's so interesting about traditionalism is it's Sufi Islam is one of the influences. So among Western thinkers, they think, as many Nazis did, that there's something in Muslim traditions that is a this worldly religion that values race and a martial culture, just like Shinto, just like the Kshatriya warrior caste among the Brahmins. So there's a contemporary angle here that some of where you're talking about, people had affinities to that, including Evola, who has influenced modern alt-right thinking, including Steve Bannon, right? And Evola hung out with the SS and liked what they had to offer, right? A racial, martial, mystical cult of Aryans, that seemed perfect. So there's connections here.
What was the role of werewolves and vampires in the Third Reich? I thought there's like basically a whole chapter in your book about this. I thought this was pretty interesting, and I had never heard this before.
Right. So again, it helps to go back to the first chapter in the 19th century. In Western folkloric tradition, right, which is more or less what we've imported in the United States, and in France, for example, werewolves and the old Catholic tradition are cursed human beings, right? They're cursed, the pentagram, they're in league with Satan. It's like witches with women. It's like women who are witches. You got men who are werewolves. And you've seen it in the Universal horror movies. Vampires, on the other hand, are kind of tragic, at least after the 18th century, the Romantic era. Traditionally, they were associated with kind of diseased corpses that came back from the grave, almost like zombies. But late 18th century, 19th century, become kind of romantic, tragic heroes. They're attractive. They don't want to kill people. They can't help it. Sure, they're often associated with Eastern Europe, but not always. What's so interesting in the Central European tradition that I've found in my research, and then it manifests with the Nazi Party in Germany, is it's reversed. Werewolves are a kind of noble creature. Maybe they commit horrible acts sometimes, but they're in touch with their own nature. They come from the same tradition as Odin's berserkers. There's use of the term werewolf to talk about partisans who fought against the Counter-Reformation in the Rhineland in the 17th century. And there's this tradition of seeing werewolves as this kind of Ur-Germanic, powerful, natural creature out of mythology, a monster, right? Hitler's monsters, that represents kind of the Ur-Germanic or Nordic nature, right? Remember, Odin had wolves, you had berserker soldiers who put on animal skins. Vampires, on the other hand, when you look at already pre-Nazi Germany and Austria, are often associated not with romantic, handsome men seducing women. They're monstrous looking with exaggerated features, Slavs or Jews, always from Eastern Europe, Poland, Romania, Serbia. They're evil. They spread disease. They're associated with rats and bats and insects, right? And why do I give you all this context? Because during the Third Reich, culminating in World War II, you have this fetishization of werewolves. So, for example, already in the 20s and 30s, there was a paramilitary group called the Werewolf that were going to kick out the French and the Belgians. And some Nazis were members of this group. When there were certain divisions created in World War II, they used the term werewolf for some of them. When Himmler and Goebbels wanted to create a partisan force at the end of World War II that would defend Germany against the evil communists coming in, what did they call it? The werewolf. And they didn't even use the play on defense that the earlier versions of the werewolves had used, the WEHR, which is also, it's Wehrmacht. It means your military, basically.
Gotcha.
There. They got rid of the H and just made it the traditional werewolf, just like in English, WER, which means man wolf. So they didn't even want, it was a direct reference to the mythological creature. And that's what they called their military defense partisan force. Conversely, there were reports from ethnic Germans fleeing west from Serbia, parts of Southeastern Europe, that they were being attacked by blood-drinking Slavs who were communist. So my point is, this folklore, this mythology, the supernatural imaginary literally colored the way that Nazis and some ordinary Germans viewed the end of the war, because those folkloric traditions influence how people imagine their reality. I'm not saying that the Nazis really thought they're creating a partisan force of people who could really become werewolves, nor do I think that all Germans thought vampires were actually attacking them. Though there's enough reports, I've seen the archives, where they claim superhuman Slavs, including women, would suddenly pounce on you and you couldn't stop them. They wanted to drink your blood. They wanted to drink Swabian blood. Swabian was the derogatory term for Germans in Eastern Europe. Schwaben. So, yes, you even see manifestations of this in the end phase of World War II.
And speaking of the end game of World War II, there was Himmler and Hans Kammler and these so-called miracle weapons. It almost feels like the culmination of all the delusions that the Nazis sold, not just their people, but themselves.
When you've had border science become institutionalized under people like Himmler and his Ahnenerbe, his academic institute for ancestral research, and you've pushed this strongly enough in universities and in popular culture, and I talk a lot about that in earlier chapters, the way like world ice theory is pushed as a alternative to Jewish physics. Of course, it has no basis in reality, but Hitler and Himmler love it, right?
Right. They rejected relativity as Jewish science, right?
And quantum mechanics, right? Yeah, exactly.
Oh, I thought quantum was considered Aryan.
No, quantum, very small things and very large things that you couldn't see, they were skeptical of.
Mm-hmm.
Remember, nuclear atomic energy is based on quantum mechanics, and they didn't make it as far. I mean, one of the theories is Himmler and Hitler didn't understand it and saw it as Jewish. And of course, they kicked out a bunch of the nuclear physicists. So, Einstein was dealing with very large things, but you need quantum mechanics, you need the atomic level particles, right, to create nuclear energy. So both aspects of modern physics, they were skeptical towards. Not every Nazi. Obviously, they paid Heisenberg to do what he could. My point is there is this tension which undermined their war effort. Now, they did a great job. You look at the per capita income of Germany versus who they were fighting. There's no question that Speer especially maximized German resources. Speer, though, as I show in my book, was constantly arguing against these Nazi leaders who, again, most of whom had no scientific background. Baldur von Schirach, who was head of the Hitler Youth. Hess had taken history and political science. Himmler never went to college. Hitler never went to college. And they're telling him, we need these rockets that'll do this. And we need these, we want planes that can be both jets and bombers. And Speer's saying, none of this is necessary or it's not going to work. We need conventional anti-aircraft stuff. We need jet fighters to take out their bombers because they got more bombers than we have jets. And constantly he'd be overruled or told, no, I want I want a V3 rocket that's going to hit the United States. And my argument is because they had a kind of science fiction view of the world, they wanted to make that reality, right? And that took lots of time and energy and resources away from more conventional aircraft, ordnance. It complicated the tanks and some of the things they made. So I'm not arguing that everything the Nazis did that may have undermined the war effort was related to supernatural thinking, but that the supernatural thinking or border scientific obsessions of people like Himmler, Hitler, Dare did not help in the distribution of resources and made Speer's job harder, as I show. He's constant reports and having to tell them there aren't miracle weapons. I don't know what you're talking about. And stop telling people that we're about to come out with a miracle weapon, right? Wunder, and it's the word for miracle is good. Wunder, like wonder, like, Wunderwaffen. And I talk about this Wagnerian scenario that a lot of the Nazis talked about. Well, if we're going to go down, we're going to go down like the gods went down in Wagner's Ring Cycle. Well, again, is that really responsible statesmanship? Where are they getting these tropes from? Nordic mythology. So that's why I call it, the last chapter, Nazi Twilight. It's a play, obviously, on the Twilight movies, vampires versus werewolves, but it's also a play on Götterdämmerung, the Twilight of the Gods, in Wagner's Ring Cycle. Elements of both of those folkloric mythological traditions were informing at least some of the decisions being made and the way that a lot of Nazis viewed this end game.
Is this romantic thinking on my part, or is what you're describing sort of the sanity prevailing finally and eventually, that this sort of magical thinking ran up against reality at a certain point?
Yes, I mean, you see the tension. You see physicists and geologists getting frustrated with who had voted Nazi, but they're like, "This is not what we signed up for." There's I quote, I think it's like the head of the Berlin Astronomy Society. He's like, "Why are you printing articles about world ice theory? We have all these high school and college people who already are bad at math, who we need to learn physics, engineers, get them in the military, and you're telling them this is a viable way of explaining the world." So there was this tension, and it was bumping up against reality. And Himmler was getting embarrassed. And who knows, 20 years down the line, if they could have maintained this level of absurdity. But you see it right now with the anti-vaxxers and the QAnon and the science deniers and people who don't believe in evolution. I mean, they're almost all right in our country in one party, right? So they're clustered, and that's dangerous. Right? It's no more rational now than it was then. We had a member of a particular party in the United States claim that women who are raped can't get pregnant. He was a senator, I think, in Missouri or congressman a few years ago. I don't know if you remember this. But he's not the only one. Of course, that's a way of justifying anti-abortion laws, but it's not based on science. So it's not unique. And that tension is not sustainable. At some point, science is going to win out. You can't prove these bizarre theories, but if you have power, if your ideology is strong enough, you can certainly muddy the water and do horrible things in the interim. Right? Have horrible policies based on supernatural or border scientific or religious thinking. Right? Faith-based thinking.
Why do you think that these ideas are coming to prominence again? I mean, I've written about and talked about in the past. I've watched friends of mine go down these dark paths, people who I served with in the military who were very smart people. I mean, it's not, I really don't believe it's a question of IQ or intelligence. Like, some very articulate, intelligent people end up believing, these sorts of QAnon conspiracy theories. And I was just wondering, we are not in America. I mean, we're doing pretty good all in all, even with the pandemic. We've been quite fortunate. We're not where the people of Germany were after World War I.
Exactly.
Why are we having this moment? Why are people gravitating? Why do they need this assurance? And why do they feel like they're living in such an unstable society at this moment that they gravitate towards these ideas?
So, great question. There are multiple responses, and there's also, then I just want to bracket something and come back to it. It's precisely why I'm so worried when people are like, well, Trump didn't actually overthrow the government and the January 6th, but we had 5% unemployment. We didn't just lose a major war. If this could happen in along with France, the oldest democracies around right now, in peacetime, when the unemployment and stock market was high, what happens if we come even close to what Germans went through? It looks like the Germans are the ones who really worked hard to maintain their democracy. We'd give it up like that. So let me bracket that and say that's what scares me about all of this. When I started the book, I wasn't that worried. It was just, I was noting a phenomenon and I wanted to study it in the past. By the time it came out in 2016, 17, we were starting to see the manifestations of this kind of thinking. People take for granted in Western democracies over the last 30, 40, 50 years, and in America for longer, that this is a kind of default. Mm-hmm. The reality, if you look at history and you look at even contemporary history in other countries, is liberal democracy generally doesn't do very well. It's generally very hard to maintain. It's a relatively new invention. You can't call what the Greeks and Romans had liberal democracy because only a few elite white men could vote and run anything. Women, slaves, even the original American and French republics, 1 in 32 people could vote. So the idea of a modern democracy where any sentient adult can vote and run for office, functioning, it's a very risky proposition. Let's start with that. The default, I would argue, for most people is authoritarianism and ignorance. So what we're seeing since the 90s is a return, in a way, to the late 19th century, what one of my colleagues calls the racial century, an obsession with race, religion, your own blood and soil and territory. And how do you make sense of a world, if that's your default, through a lot of these kind of effective, supernatural, conspiratorial views, right? That's what helps. You need recourse to something spiritual. And if traditional Christianity isn't going to do it, or you're not a fundamentalist in some way, evangelical, Muslim, then QAnon, then Soros, then, Jewish space slave, something that explains your reality and helps create a sense of community, right? When you no longer have these clear sides and you can pick one. I'm on the side of American liberal democracy. I'm fighting the communists. That's gone. And in periods like that, the world's a very unstable place. And the default, because liberal democracy is not, I would argue, such an easy thing to maintain, is to resort to these kinds of more territorial, more border scientific, faith-based views of the world. And that's why I pushed back earlier when you called the Himmler's views nonsense, because as you point out, there are people, it's a Cartesian dualism, but for non-Christians, right? Descartes famously said, I can study physics and not be, at odds with the church, because I've got my faith here and I've got my empirical faculties there. Well, you have pilots and engineers, people in the military who are very bright and can do very impressive technical things, and somehow they can park that rationality and systematic at the door when they go to a Mike Flynn rally, right? And even Mike Flynn can do it. Human beings are wonderful that way, that in their ability to do that, but that's also dangerous.
Suffice to say, this was an illuminating conversation for me, as I hope it was for our listeners as well. I knew that Himmler and his gang were deeply invested in the occult, but Eric's book brought out a lot to light that I never knew about. Some of the alliterations and comparisons to contemporary politics are likely to be controversial, But I think we all owe it to ourselves to ask some of these difficult questions about what is happening in America today, not just politically, but socially and culturally. A lot of people are unhappy and dissatisfied. Why is that? And is there anything we can do to turn things around for them? Eric's book is called Hitler's Monsters and is available wherever books are sold. I highly recommend it, as he really did a ton of research for this book, which is filled with source citations. I hope more people will give it a read and contemplate how a seemingly rational society came completely off the rails. Until next time, I'm Jack Murphy.
A huge thanks to Dr. Eric Kurlander. His book, Hitler's Monsters, A Supernatural History of the Third Reich, is available on Amazon and everywhere you find your favorite books. You can follow Jack Murphy on Twitter at JackMurphyRGR, and don't forget to follow Military Matters on Twitter as well at StripesMMPod. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and share this podcast. We grow by word of mouth, so share this episode. And finally, we're looking for your military ghost stories. Live in haunted housing, specters in your specter, or maybe you found yourself on patrol with a poltergeist. We want to share your story on our very haunted Halloween episode. Shoot us over your military ghost story at militarymatters@stripes.com. Till then, I'm Rod Rodriguez, that was Jack Murphy, and we'll see you at the next episode.